For anybody who's not able to be here, of course, we always do a recording. Today is death, afterlife, and mourning. Some serious topics. There's going to be a little bit of humor, a little bit of um, philosophy, a little bit of interest, because there's a lot to this idea. Oops, I just messed. I lost you. All right, I found you again. uh, there's a lot that's going on here. So we'll get deep, but we're going to have a little taste of humor as we go along as well. So let's begin with Jewish teachings about the afterlife. And you notice that there's a plural there. There's not a Jewish teaching about the afterlife. There's not a Jewish rule about the afterlife. As you saw in your readings, I hope, there are lots of different perspectives within Judaism that account for what happens after we die. Within that universe of Judaism, we have a recognition that there is not one single Jewish answer, and that there is not ever allowed to be one single Jewish answer. That's an important part of it. There's a story in the Midrash about the letter Bet. The letter Bet looks like this, right? Have you seen the letter Bet before? Again, it's like this. I might have drawn it backwards. I'm not sure. My camera's flipped. I'm looking at a mirror. The letter Bet is the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Aleph, Bet. Actually, that's where we get the word alphabet from. Greeks took it from the Phoenicians, and that's the Phoenicians used the same letters as the ancient Israelites. So Aleph, Bet. Bet is the second letter of the alphabet, as suggested by its name, but it's the first word of the Torah. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, a Bereshit is the first word of the Torah. The rabbis looked at this and said, how can the letter Bet be the beginning of the Torah, but be the second letter of the Aleph Bet? Surely, if you're talking about beginnings, it's not a random letter. It's so close to being the first letter, it's just off by one. Are there any computer programmers in the group? Anybody do no computer programmers? We have no computer programmers. The other day we had no lawyers. I think once we even had no doctors. What's going on here? Is this a synagogue or what? So there's a principle. I was going to make a joke. There's a common type of error in programming that's called an off by one error, which is where, due to some of the unique ways that computers actually work, sometimes a calculation, if you program it incorrectly, will be off by one. Instead of starting at the year, for example, they always say a new century starts in the first year. It's not in the year 2000, but the year 2001. You remember hearing this a few years ago? Okay, maybe. Doesn't matter. The important thing in this story is the letter Bet is the second letter. It's only off by one. The rabbi said there must be some significance to this. And the way that they drew significance from that was by looking at the shape of the letter Bet. It's like this, this, this. And they said, okay, the letter Bet, it's closed on three sides. I don't know if I just drew it backwards or not. The letter Bet, it's closed on three sides. It's shaped like this. How's that for a visual? That tells us that the world beyond Torah is closed on three sides. The Torah is open on one side. Everything that's in the Torah, everything that is a part of our lives, a part of this life, a part of this world, is open to us. But everything that's above is closed, meaning we can't see into the mind of God. Everything that is before, everything that existed before creation is closed to us. When physicists talk about what came before the Big Bang, they say, we can't measure it. We can get very, very close to the Big Bang, but we can't measure anything before that. It's an incredible coincidence between ancient Jewish text and contemporary science. That is closed to us. We cannot know what came before. And the bottom is closed, meaning that is closed to us. What happens when you die and you're buried in the ground? What happens after that is closed to us. Now, of course, Jews being Jews, we have, instead of saying we're not going to discuss those things, rather we have lots of different theories. We have all sorts of theories. That's everything that mysticism is all about. What is the mind of God? What's going on in the heavens? How can we articulate that? We've got diagrams and all sorts of different things. We've got all sorts of theories about what existed before this world, that there were thousands of worlds before this world was created, and that this is the most perfect world that God could have created out of all possible worlds. There are all sorts of theories about what happens after we die. But because these three things are closed to us, we can never have a definitive answer within Judaism. We're not allowed to have a definitive answer, because that would be hubris. Judaism, at the end of the day, is less concerned with what happens after this life than what happens during this life. In this moment, everything in Judaism is built around this idea of what is the right thing to do. What does the halakha tell us we should do right now? What are the mitzvot that we are doing right now? You don't say a blessing over something that could be, like other religions might. You only say a blessing over something that is. When you've got the bread in your hand is when you say the hamotzi. You don't say hamotzi when you're driving home and you're thinking about, oh, I'm going to have a great dinner with a nice loaf of bread. We're concerned about what is, what we do in this life, what decisions we make, how we live ethically is more important than what consequences may or may not come after this life has ended. Judaism teaches that it's beyond our knowledge, and so we should be more concerned with those things that are within our knowledge, within our realm, within our circle of interest and circle of concern. So now that you know there are lots of different Jewish beliefs, what are some of those beliefs? If we look through history, what kinds of things do we find within Judaism? Let's start with the Bible. In the Tanakh, we have many references to an afterworld called Sheol. You may have heard of Sheol. It's also same word that's used in Yiddish. It's been said that it's like the Jewish hell, right? Have you heard this before, Sheol? You're very relaxed tonight. Maybe you're just deep in contemplation. Maybe you're still, sleeping off the Purim. Okay. Um, there's a little bit of life. I can see you're with me. So Sheol is the word that's used in the Bible when someone dies and they've gone to wherever it is, the hereafter is described as Sheol. That's the word that's used. The Bible never gives a description of what Sheol is. However, modern scholars have looked at every time that this word is used in the Bible and looked at how it is used in context, and it seems to be close to synonymous with a tomb, that it literally describes being underneath or underground. When you die and go to Sheol, they're talking about your body goes to be inside the tomb, underground. That this is a literal description of where your physical body is. That's the predominant theory among scholars at this time. Now, different ideas. So when the Bible talks about Sheol in biblical times, what did it mean to somebody living 3,000 years ago during the time of King David? When people talked about Sheol, our best guess of scholars who look at these things from every possible angle, our best guess is that Sheol refers to the physical grave. Now that changed quite a bit by the time we got to Talmudic times. Now we're talking not 3,000 years ago, but maybe 2,000 years ago. And 2,000 years ago, we have the Talmud, we have the early rabbinic texts. We have the early rabbinic texts, and they describe a totally different concept of what comes after life, and they talk about the olam haba, the world to come. However, like the Bible, which never describes what Sheol is, we just have to make our best guess from context. We have to do the same thing in the Talmud. The Talmud, which is, here's the shelf above me. This whole shelf right here is all Talmud. That's not even the whole thing. There's a lot of stuff in there. There are so many details and minutiae. There's even a discussion about if a baby dove is 50 feet away from its mother, the rule is different from how you treat it if it's 51 feet away from its mother. Okay, these are the kinds of discussions that are in the Talmud. And even though the Talmud goes into incredible detail about every topic imaginable, and some topics you probably wouldn't even think of, like baby doves, it also is strangely silent of the many, many times that it talks about olam haba. What does the Talmud tell us about olam haba? The world to come is the literal translation. The world to come, olam haba. When you die, you go there. That some people receive a greater reward than others. In fact, sometimes in the language of the Talmud and the language of other rabbinical texts, it says certain people have a portion in the world to come, and other people who are wicked do not have a portion in the world to come. So is it you die and then you're poor in the afterlife? But if you're a good person, you have a portion, you're rich in the afterlife? That seems to be the description. And you have this metaphor of prosperity in the afterlife, in the world to come, is sort of riffed on in a lot of different ways. You have stories of rabbis who reach into the olam haba, which seems to be a place that, a dimension, so to speak, that exists, and pull out, magical items from the olam haba and place magical items back into the olam haba. That there's some sort of transition that's possible here. You also have descriptions that say the olam haba is not a place. It's not something that happens immediately when you die, but you have descriptions of resurrection after Messianic times. Oops, I got the order mixed up. In Jewish mysticism, actually, let me talk about Messianic times first, because that's connected with the Talmud. When I say Messianic here, Please understand, we are not talking about Messianic Jews. In fact, this is not, Messianic Jews don't even believe in a Jewish Messiah. They believe in a Christian Messiah. That's why they're Christians. A Jewish Messiah has all sorts of different prophecies within Jewish texts relating to what will happen when the Jewish Messiah arrives. In the Messianic belief, which is very popular from, we're talking after the Talmudic times, there's an idea that once the Messiah comes, everybody who has died will be physically resurrected, bodily resurrection. Your body will be returned to you. You'll be reincarnated physically in your body. This is what during the most of the Middle Ages, what most Jews genuinely believed, and some Jews also still believe today. It's a major part of our tradition that your body would be physically resurrected, that we would rise up and either sort of digging through the ground, tunnel our way into Jerusalem, or that we would rise up and walk to Jerusalem, where we would all come together, all the people in the world, to greet the Messiah. One of the miracles, by the way, of the Messiah is that all of the people in the world will be able to fit into Jerusalem and it won't be crowded. So don't worry, you can even practice social distance in the end times. Somebody asked me recently, what does Judaism teach about the end times? This is one of those things. The Messiah will come, bring peace to all of the nations of the world, and everybody who has died will be resurrected in their body. This was a very popular, ubiquitous Jewish belief for hundreds of years in the Middle Ages. Now that gives rise to ideas of mysticism. In mysticism, there is a separation between the body and the soul. By the way, these messianic prophecies are a major part of why you may have heard that Jews are supposed to be buried in a cemetery, in a coffin made of natural materials that can decay, because you wouldn't want to wake up trapped in a steel or concrete box, assuming if you believed that you're going to wake up physically in your body. And you wouldn't want to be missing an arm or missing a leg, which is why, Israeli soldiers, for example, if they lose an arm or leg in battle, they'll send in soldiers on a mission to rescue a lost limb of a soldier. so that they can, and they'll keep it so that that soldier, when they die, hopefully many years later, can be buried with their body. Somebody who's, or any amputee, will often keep the limb, keep the bones, so that they can later be buried with it. This is a common custom in Israel. And that's built on this idea that your whole body has to be together, all of your bones have to be in one place, so that when you're resurrected, your body can find itself. You don't want to be resurrected, missing a finger or something. Now I'm going to jump back up to mysticism here. Mysticism has a separation between the body and the soul. This is language that is much more popular today. We have, most of us, I believe, a concept of a division between the body and the soul, the physical body and the animating force of our body. That these two are somewhat independent, connected but independent. You've got the car, and you've got the gas that's in the car, and then you've got the driver of the car. And all three of these are necessary for the car to go, unless you've got one of those, self-driving cars. But, or, if you've got an electric car, maybe you don't need the gas. This is metaphors getting away from me here. You need all of these parts for it to go. You need the car and the driver and the gas. But these are separate things. You can have gas without a car. You can have a car without a driver. That these are things that can be separated. And there's the same idea with mind, body, and soul, that there's your physical body, there's your spiritual animating force, which makes your body alive. And then there's your mind, which is its own separate unit, that these combine together to make a living being. But when you're no longer a living being, those pieces uh, continue to persist. And in fact, the Jewish soul, according to mysticism, has three different components. There's the nefesh, the neshama, and the ruach. And these three different components play different roles in our spiritual existence. And each of these three different parts goes through a different process. And depending on which school of mysticism you follow, one of two things happens. Either your soul goes through a process of purification, as one of my dear colleagues used to say, Eloheinu shama shenatata bi. This is from our morning prayers. My God, the soul you have given me is pure. And what my colleague, this is my old roommate from rabbinical school, used to say, I'm sorry, the soul you've given me is pure, God. I'm sorry for everything else I've done to it since I got it. All of that stuff that happens to our souls over the course of being a living being. All of that damage and grit and grime that gets stuck onto our souls over the course of lifetime is broken down, is peeled away, is polished off through a process of purification. And then once that process is complete, our soul can ascend and reunify with the source of all being, reunify with God. That's the first possibility. In a different school of mysticism, our souls serve a particular function. God sent us to this world because this world is functionally damaged, that there's something in this world which is shattered, which is broken, which is cracked, and it's our job as holy beings, as sacred individuals, to work and push our efforts toward repairing the world, tikkun olam. The world is broken and we are partners with God in repairing it. According to this school of mysticism, our job is actually to fulfill a certain number of mitzvot, a certain number of commandments that are designated for our soul. We've got our assignment. We don't know what that assignment is, but often that assignment is not completed in just one lifetime, and it takes many lifetimes. So our soul is resurrected into a new body to complete further mitzvot, to do further tikkun that we could not complete in a previous lifetime. Now, one thing you might notice about these different possibilities, these different historical beliefs in Judaism, is that some of them are mutually exclusive. If our soul reincarnates into a new body, then it is impossible to have bodily resurrection, right? If you've got your soul and now it's in a new body, a new baby that's been born, what happens? Your body, that body can't then be resurrected. There would be no soul to occupy it because you've already got a new body, right? So in Judaism, even though there are many different beliefs, none of these beliefs are exclusive, meaning there's nothing that says you have to believe any one of these things, and this is not an exhaustive list. This is a broad sampling of some of the most common, most popular, most important views of life after death throughout the history of Judaism. Now, Maimonides is the last one on my list because he has a very interesting theory. In his writing, Guide for the Perplexed, he talks about life after death, and he talks about resurrection. And he talks about eternal life. That after the coming of the Messiah, there will be resurrection, there will be eternal life. This was universally accepted among Jews in the time of Maimonides, but he does it in a very interesting way. When he describes what he means by resurrection, when he describes what he means by eternal life, He says, I have already described this elsewhere, and I will not describe it again here. That's a strange way to put it, right? Asked and answered. When you look through the rest of his writing, you see a description of what it means to have eternal life elsewhere, deep in a different passage of his Guide for the Perplexed, which says, in essence, I'm paraphrasing, that the life of someone's life, the eternal life that lives on after them, are the memories and the achievements that belong to a person in their lifetime. So whatever you achieve in your life that lives on after you, that endures and continues to have an impact on the world after you die, that is your eternal life. All of those who remember you and love you and mourn your passing, that is your eternal life. That we live on in the memories of those who preserve our memory. That is, according to Maimonides, that is your eternal life in this world. That every single one of us has a lasting impact on this world, changes the world in a permanent and irreversible way. And the world that exists afterwards, the Olam Haba, is that world that we all contribute to. Again, this is a paraphrase, and these are not the only options of what different Jews have believed in different times. This, by the way, this radical rationalist approach has at various times been very popular in the Reform movement. Now let's talk about less philosophical, more down to earth, no pun intended, when someone is dying. There are different Jewish traditions about what somebody does when they are dying, when they know that the end of their life is drawing near. One is to prepare an ethical will. You're probably all familiar with a property will or a financial will. There's a term for it, a will that's related to property, but you may not have heard of an ethical will, which is describing not what possessions you would like to pass on to your children, your loved ones, to the world at large, but the life lessons, the wisdom, the learning and yearning and teaching that you would like to endure and be passed on after your lifetime. There's a very old tradition going back over 1,000 years of writing out an ethical will of what values and teachings you wish to pass on to your children in particular and to your community at large. And it's a beautiful tradition of preparing an ethical will that's approached with the same seriousness and diligence as preparing your will relating to things like your finances and your property. Someone who is dying or at death's door recites a particular structured prayer called the vidui, which literally means confession. It's confessing one's sins to God. You might have heard, there's no such thing in Judaism as confession. Well, no, we don't go to the priest on Sunday, or you don't come to the rabbi. I don't sit behind a screen and you say I've done many bad things. But at the end of your life, we do have a confession to God, again, to help assist with whatever that is that comes next, so that your spirit is a little bit lighter, so that your soul is a little bit cleaner, more pure. And that is not a confession to a rabbi or to any human being, but a confession between you and God. When somebody is actively dying, anybody here in healthcare? few of you, you know what actively dying means. For somebody who's not in healthcare, it's an odd phrase to say actively dying. Uh, but if you're in healthcare, it's clear when somebody is at the very end of their life, usually their last days, maybe even weeks, rarely longer than that. It's very clear when somebody is in the process of dying, when your body is shutting down, and it's a very specific process that happens, stage by stage by stage. When somebody is in this process, there is a term in Judaism for actively dying, and you have that person has a special status, which is a goses. A goses, the best way to translate it, it's not a literal translation, but the best way to translate it is somebody who's actively dying. When a loved one is actively dying, you may not be able to communicate with them. Or if you can communicate with them, it might be very difficult to have anything resembling a conversation. It might be small phrases, and it's a very difficult time. But Jewish law tells us that we have a responsibility to care for somebody who is a goses, because they're still a living person, that their body is still housing that person that we have loved, although that person that we've loved is no longer accessible to us. And there are particular laws if that person has not had the chance to say the vidui. We are able to say that prayer on their behalf. Say, on behalf of my father, mother, grandfather, uncle, whoever it is, I wish to say this prayer of confession because he or she cannot say this themselves. At this time, we also, it is customary to recite the Shema. If somebody is aware enough to recite the Shema at the end of their life, it's considered a tremendous mitzvah, a tremendous blessing for the words of the Shema to be the final words that cross your lips. One of the most famous examples of this is Rabbi Akiva. If you've taken my Rabbis You Should Know course earlier this month, you know about Rabbi Akiva, who died as a martyr. He was captured by the Romans, burned alive, and as he was dying, he was shouting through the flames the words of the Shema. That's how important it is for the Shema to be part of your prayers throughout your lifetime, even to the very last breath. When someone is a goses, one of the questions that we often get asked in this modern world, that we ask ourselves or that we have to contend with, are what do we do for somebody who's dying? What do we do for somebody who has no quality of life, who may or may not be aware of the world around them, but their body is continuing to persist? Now, there's a lot of volumes and volumes of Jewish law written about this issue. But the easiest way that I can summarize it, the basic principle, is that we neither impede nor hasten the course of nature as somebody is dying. We don't cause them to die faster by taking action. And if somebody is dying, it is not necessary to take extraordinary measures under halacha to preserve the life of somebody whose body cannot sustain itself. That's a very general principle, and there's a lot of nuance to this idea within Judaism. But that's a good starting point. What happens when someone dies? Well, usually the first person in a traditional Jewish community to receive the body is the Chevra Kadisha, the Jewish Burial Society. Of course, in modern days, there might be a mortuary that works with them or a funeral home. that works with the Jewish burial society. In the shtetl, in traditional Jewish life, the Chevra Kadisha was considered the most elite Chevra you could be a part of. There were many Chevras, many, how would we translate Chevra? A beneficial society, right? There are many beneficial societies in the community. You might have one chevra that was in charge of, maintaining the building, one chevra that was in charge of, raising funds for the poor, one chevra that was in charge of, teachers for the students. And the most exclusive, the most important chevra was the Chevra Kadisha, literally the holy society or holy burial society. Which would be the top leaders of the community, men and women, who were responsible for caring for someone who has died, caring for the body of someone who has died, but also caring for the spirit of someone who has died. And they do this primarily in two very important ways. The first is called shmira, which means guarding, literally. Um, If you've heard Shomer Shabbos, that's, guarding and keeping Shabbat. Shmira in this case, literally guarding by being physically with the body of someone who has died and guarding over it. So that when someone has died from the time that they've died in a traditional Jewish community until the time that they're buried, their body is never left alone. During this period, the person who is with them maintains a prayerful atmosphere, usually by reciting psalms, by reciting prayers at the appropriate times for prayer. Um, and again, this is 24 hours a day until the body is buried, which is part of the reason why burials in traditional Jewish societies, we're talking about the shtetl, were usually done within 24 hours. Um, this is also a reflection of an age in which, most people, 99% of people, never travel 50 miles away from the place that they were born in their entire lifetime. So that means your entire family is right there. Nobody needs to travel from New York to attend the funeral. You don't have to make any special arrangements. You don't have to travel. These days, many people don't even live where they will be buried. You might live in McAllen and have a burial plot in another state. It's not that uncommon these days. So that 24 hours, that custom, and it is a custom, it's not a law, that a Jewish burial happens within 24 hours. There's a lot of flexibility in that today, but certainly in the shtetl, in the traditional Jewish society, that was followed pretty regularly. The second job of the Chevra Kadisha is called tahara, which is washing the body of someone who has died. When someone's died, their clothes are removed, the body is washed, and white garments are put on them. There are special garments that are used only for burial. The hems are unfinished, and the cloth is white and undyed, with two ideas being behind this. Number one, white garments symbolizing purity and humility, and the second symbolizing the idea that in death we are all equals. There's a uniform, right? There's a uniform for people who've died. You don't get to build a pyramid, a tomb filled with all of your gold and jewelry and crowns and necklaces and rings like the Egyptians did. In death, we are all equals. Uh, Whether you're a millionaire or millionaires and billionaires, or whether you're a pauper, We are all equal in the eyes of God. We are all equal in death. After the funeral has happened, or um, uh, upon the time of the burial, we're moving sort of forward through this process, the focus shifts from the time that someone dies until the time that they are buried. All of the energy, all of the focus of the community is on taking care of that person in their time of transition. They are the center. The center shifts after the burial to the family, the people who are mourning, the people who have lost a loved one. There's a shift. In Judaism, there's a halachic distinction, a legal distinction of who are the mourners, specifically the 7 relations. That's father, mother, brother, sister, uh, spouse, son, and daughter. Those are called the 7 relations. Uh, Somebody with one of those relations is considered to be a status of a mourner, which means the community takes care of those people. When somebody who's a second cousin might feel the loss very strongly, but they are still focused on providing for the immediate family, the 7 relations. Those are the 7 people who traditionally participate in Kriya, which is tearing a garment. In ancient times, people would instinctively tear at their clothes out of grief at losing someone that they loved. But in modern times, we often use a Kriya ribbon, which can be pinned to your clothing and torn and worn by moving it from one article of clothing to another each day. Other communities have a tradition of using scissors and cutting, physically cutting a shirt over the heart. Of course, the burial includes the funeral itself. Flowers, or the lack thereof. Because burials were typically done within 24 hours, there was not a need for flowers, and there never emerged a tradition of giving flowers for a funeral. In outside of Jewish societies, where there was no custom of burying within 24 hours, the flowers were often necessary to mask the smell of someone who had died. There was no embalming, there was no refrigeration, and as crude as it may be, that's why we have a custom of bringing flowers to a funeral. Well, not we, but other people have that custom. In a Jewish funeral, there are often no flowers, although again today this is part of a custom that many Jewish communities have adopted, but they do use flowers. You'll often hear Jewish announcements, might be, in lieu of flowers, please make a donation, please send your regards, something other than flowers, right? There are prayers that are part of the service, such as El Maleh, God full of mercy. This is followed by the Hesped, which is the eulogy. And there is usually a burial and a special service at the graveside. Sometimes the funeral is done at the temple or at the home of the mourners, more often at the temple, and the burial is at a separate location. At the graveside, there's a second portion of the service. This is followed by Shiva, the first 7 days of mourning. Some of the customs of Shiva. Shiva literally means sitting, and it's a time where you're sitting in your home. You're not going out. If you're one of these 7 mourners, you're not Um, you're not partying. You're sitting in your home and waiting for guests who will come to you. Um, some of the customs, and these depend, they're regional customs. Some of these you see in different parts of the world. Um, but some of these customs include covering mirrors in the home, refraining from shaving or even bathing during those 7 days, because those are considered luxuries. Um, it's very common, for example, in Israel, if you see somebody who's a little bit unshaven, sometimes I forget to shave in the morning. Today, I've got a little bit of scruff there. But if I were going in Israel and I had, this kind of scruff, somebody might look at me and say, "Oh my gosh, who died? What happened? You're not shaved." Um, because very often that's when you see somebody, not shaving. It's also tradition not to listen to music, not to go to joyous celebrations like weddings, um, and to light a Shiva candle, which is a special, large candle that burns for 7 days throughout this period. During this time, there are also Shiva services, which are regular weekday prayer services, but they're held rather than at the temple, at the home of the people who are mourning. This is a way that the community comes to the mourner to support and uplift in a very difficult time. Shiva is followed by Shloshim, which are the first 30 days of mourning, in which somebody may leave the house, may return to work, may begin to take part in public services, but probably still does not during that time participate in, going to concerts, listening to music, and dancing and parties. That 30 days is followed by Sha'ah, in which means a year, which are the either 11 months, these are two different customs, either 11 months or 12 months, depending on the custom, after the funeral, that somebody will continue to say Kaddish every day, that will continue to mourn the person's loss privately, but publicly will carry on with the basics of living life, going back to work full time, taking part in parties and music and celebrations, being a full member of society in every way, but continuing to mourn over the course of that year. Finally, we have the Kaddish Prayer. The Kaddish Prayer itself is one which uh, does not mention mourning. Even though we call it the mourner's Kaddish, it's a prayer that's said by mourners, not, uh, not as a prayer of mourning. The Kaddish prayer, the actual translation, is all about how great and wonderful God is. It's all about aggrandizing and uplifting God and uplifting God's name. This is something that we do for a couple of different reasons. One is that it's considered a special blessing to lead a Kaddish prayer and to have the congregation respond. That there is a special zichut, a special merit in leading a Kaddish prayer and having the congregation respond. And the Kaddish, unlike some certain prayers, you can say on someone else's behalf. And so there came to be a custom that when somebody was mourning, they would say the Kaddish prayer on behalf of their loved one who had died, adding, even after their death, adding to their honor and to their blessing, something that they could not do themselves. This is a principle we see across all of these different processes that we've described, that even when someone dies, we continue to give to them generously. we continue to give everything that we can to someone who has died because they cannot give anything back. It is an act of greatest charity and honor to honor the dead. That's what's reflected in reciting the Kaddish Prayer. I'd like to end on a note that is not unrelated, but something that's a little bit beyond the bounds of Judaism, something that is helpful for me, um, both personally and as a spiritual guide, and something that many people find to be helpful. You may have heard of the stages of grief, the 5 stages of grief. This theory, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, is mostly not accepted by today's medical professionals. It's mostly rejected, that it doesn't really describe things in a very useful or accurate way that people experience. You know, the anger, bargaining, you've heard this before, right? What But because it was among the first widely known theories, it's still the most commonly known by most people of what mourning, what constitutes mourning, or what mourning consists of. There's the word. Uh, a much more helpful framework are Worden's 4 tasks of grieving. The first thing you might notice is that these are not stages of grieving. They're tasks of grieving. These are tasks that a person who's grieving undertakes to move forward through their grief. They're not in a particular order. Well, they're listed in an order, which tends to be the order that they most often follow. But sometimes you do it, sometimes you tie your shoes, that's a task. Sometimes they come untied again, and you have to tie your shoes again. It's the same with the tasks of mourning. Sometimes these are not tasks that you complete, but they are tasks that focus you towards a moving on in a helpful and healthful way from a terrible loss. The first task is to accept the reality of the loss. You often hear somebody, who's just lost a loved one say, "I can't believe it. I feel like they're still here." That's a normal feeling. And one of the tasks is to confront that feeling and to recognize that you have lost someone. The second is to work through the pain and the grief. It is very common in both American culture and in Latin culture to take grief and to suppress it, to say, I'm going to refuse to feel sad. Either, my loved one is in a better place, or my loved one wouldn't want me to be sad. And so there's this social pressure to suppress what we're really feeling. In reality, we know that that feeling is still there, even if we suppress it. The only way to deal with it in a healthy way is to feel that grief, to sit in that pain. And it's not pleasant. I don't remember ever getting a contract when I was born that said all of your days will be pleasant. God never promises us that. God doesn't promise us that everything is going to be happy every single day of our lives. God only promises us life every single day of our lives. And grief is a part of that process of living. And the pain of grief is a part of that process too. The third task is adjusting to a new environment. Adjusting to a world in which your loved one is missing, in which the role that they played now must be fulfilled by someone else, sometimes yourself. If you had a loved one who cooked dinner every single night, for example, you've got to find a way to eat dinner. Whether you cook it yourself and find a way to honor their memory in doing so, maybe cooking their favorite recipes, or if somebody else begins cooking dinner. And that brings us to the last task, which is finding an enduring connection with your deceased loved one while moving forward with life, recognizing that you will continue to change and grow as a person even without someone who you have loved, but that you never lose that connection. The love never dies, even after the person does. That's where I'm going to stop here. I know that this has been a heavy session, but we'll continue our discussion offline in just a moment.